back to Photoshop. We'll on the workflow. So the first thing you do is you decide what you want to do with the image. What's wrong? What's right? What do I want to see? And then you do various adjustments on it. This one turns out to be fairly decent, although it's a pretty good example, which I'll show you a couple ways to make selections of just particular parts of the picture. And when you open up Photoshop, if you just first open it up, none of these windows will be open. You have to manually open all these windows, and there'll be a toolbar. Generally, the default way is that the toolbar will be on the left side here. And these are all sorts of different tools that you could use. Some of the major ones that I'll be talking about is this one called a quick selection tool, which you could select individual parts of a picture. The crop tool, which is really pretty vital to cropping, as the name says. Eyedropper is really good to check the color and the density of your picture. This one called the spot healing brush tool is really fabulous for getting rid of dust specks, which you got to be really careful if there's a dust speck in the sky with some stars, because then you'll start getting rid of stars or duplicating stars. Another handy one is on the same icon is what's called burning and dodging. A few people here I think have made prints, and in the darkroom we used to do something called, if a part of the picture was too light, you would burn it in. You would add more light just to that particular part. For example, just the sky, and you'd hold your hand over half of the picture to create a shadow, since you're working at an enlarger and the light's coming straight down onto the picture. And then you burn in the sky. You would add more light to the sky to make it darker in the final print. And if you wanted to make the sky lighter, in case it was too dark, you'd hold your hand, creating a shadow over the sky, and that's called dodging. You would dodge the light from the initial exposure, so it would get less exposure. So those two tools, the names continue on in Photoshop, and the two tools are here, and those I will show you. The magnifying glass is real good. That's basically just enlarging or making smaller the image, and the hand is good for moving things around to looking at certain parts, and then you could also use a wheel on your mouse to either reduce or enlarge the picture, the same as what the magnifying glass is doing. So initially you decide, well, what do you want to do to this picture? To my eye, the sky is a little bit low in contrast, and the background tone of the sky is a little bit light. So I want to darken that. The rocks themselves look pretty good though. If I went to adjustments and curves, this is how you find pretty much all the adjustments that you'll need. As you go under the image section on the menu above, and go down and find curves under adjustments, and you get a window that looks like this. On the background of this is the histogram of the picture that you just opened up. Curves is, if you were just going to use one tool in Photoshop, you could use curves for practically everything. You could use it for brightness, to make it brighter, make it darker. You could use it to increase contrast or decrease contrast, and you could also use it to slightly change the color if you wanted to. Or actually, you could change the color quite a bit. I'll start back over. I'll go back to the eyedropper, and I usually check the color again just to recheck and make sure that the color itself is fairly balanced. And it's pretty good. I mean, it's nothing. Some areas are a little bit off, but it's nothing that I would want to change drastically enough. Where and then also if I add some contrast, if I make this background a little bit darker, that some of that color might be masked. So I'll go to Image, Adjustments, and Curves. So the Curves opens up, and the other thing to know, I think everybody here knows what contrast is, high contrast versus low contrast. a lot of images from digital cameras come out fairly low in contrast. I think that's just the nature of the digital imaging, and it also depends on what you're shooting, whether the subject matter has high contrast or low contrast lighting. We're out in the middle of the night with not a whole lot of lights around, and just using starlight to try to light our pictures, and so that's an extremely low contrast situation where the stars, I mean, to our eyes, the stars look pretty bright against the black background, but the amount of contrast between the star and the black background is very, very low. So so you get a very low, you can get a very low contrast image out of each out of your camera, and that's why I usually say that virtually every picture from a digital camera needs some sort of processing. That it's rare to have a picture that you don't do anything to, because there's usually something, even if it's just minor, that needs to be done to the picture. And that's one thing that you you will learn along as time goes on, is you learn how to look at a picture, and you look at details before you do anything to it. What do the corners look like? What's the overall color look like? What do I need to do? Are there any really bright areas? Are there any really dark areas that I need to change? And what are the shapes of the areas that I need to change? Things like that. This particular picture, there's almost a first quarter moon that's lighting up the rocks here. So that's helping me a lot. You can see a lot of detail on the rocks already, and then the overall exposure that I use in the camera exposed the rocks pretty well, and the Milky Way. Maybe overexposed the sky a little bit, so it became a little low in contrast. So I'll have to deal with that. With curves, I think it's called curves because there's this line that goes through this box here, and you could stretch it and make it into a curvy shape, and that'll cause all kinds of alterations in your photo. So the basic things are things like contrast. If you go to the lower left-hand corner of this line here, you put your cursor on that bottom left-hand dot. You hold your mouse down. You basically grab that, and you move that to the right. You're basically increasing the blacks in your picture, just the dark parts. And as you can see, the stars really aren't changing that much. You can move this quite a bit over, and there's still a lot of stars. So the stars themselves haven't really darkened much. The very, very dark parts of your picture get dark really fast, and the parts that are fairly light get a little bit darker, but they don't change quite as fast. You still see detail here on the rock. You still see the Milky Way. You still see a whole bunch of stars here, because you're basically adding contrast to that to the picture there. And so if I'm looking at the stars, I increase that until I get to a point where I like the background color of or the background tone of the sky. Most night sky pictures, if you look at them, the sky generally isn't completely black. It's usually a very, very dark gray, and a lot of that, of course, in the center part of this Milky Way, you won't get a lot of black because there's so many stars. That's why we have a Milky Way. The density of the stars is so much. But also, if you make it too dark, you start to lose a lot of the fainter stars. The good thing about things like curves is that you could do multiple iterations of the curves. You could do it once, and you could keep doing it. And I'll use the shortcut here. And if you take the upper right-hand corner, you grab onto that with your mouse, then you're lightening mainly the highlights of the picture, the bright things like stars, the lighter parts of the rock. So you could accentuate those at once. If in curves, if you start from the very center and you pull this curve up or down, you'll basically be changing almost everything in the picture. You'll be starting at what's called the midtones, the middle tones, and you'll either lighten all of them or darken all of them at about the same rate. Yes, Preston.
Okay.
Oops.
Can you pull that back up again, please?
Sure.
What I don't get, or I guess I do get, maybe I don't. We're just using this part of the picture, right? This is it. There's no more information past this way. Am I right about that?
More or less, yeah. I mean, there's a little bit, but there's not much.
So we're just, anything you're doing in here is really effective, doesn't take any effect until right about in here. I mean, if you bend this up like this, it's not affecting anything up in this range, correct?
Well,
Pretty much? Because what I'm trying to get my head around is, we want to have a gap here, I think, so we don't have to black.
right.
We want to have this shifted over a little bit. And then this is really, the whole shot is really right in here.
Right.
And so we're just dealing with that part. And this stuff over here, it's not having an effect.
No, but the curves has an effect on every part of the picture. Preston's question was about the curves. He's looking at the histogram here, which is the gray graph on the background of the curves, and all the information of the picture is here. It tails off, and then we have almost no information from about the center, the midtones on up to super bright whites, essentially. The highlights are basically right about here, Preston. When we think about it, the brighter
stars be?
Pardon?
Where would the stars be?
The stars would essentially be right about here,
Okay.
and which is on a normal picture, that's a midtone. That's a middle tone. A lot of flesh tones are middle tones, and so that's obviously people's faces aren't as bright as stars, but in this particular picture, the information is much more to the left-hand side of the picture.
So when you were on the left-hand side where the real dark stuff is, and adjusting, that's why you said it doesn't have that much effect on the stars, because the stars are more midtone.
Right, but this method affects photographs all in the same way. So that if I had a daytime picture, and I pulled this the lower left hand over to the right here, it would do the same thing. It would just make the scene, the blacks much blacker, and increase the contrast in the photo. It would leave something like a blue sky not really change too much. It would add contrast to it. In other words, you would probably have it a much deeper blue, but it wouldn't really actually change the brightness of it that much. And the same with although I probably shouldn't have told you that this was the histogram, because that's probably, you're thinking a little bit too much, because as you're working on the picture, you're not really, for the most part, you're not really dealing with the histogram anymore. You could, I have a window that has the histogram that's open. You could try to keep it, the mound, the little peak away from the left-hand side, but as you work on the picture, the histogram, as Photoshop reads it, is going to change a little bit. And then so at this point, as long as you've got a good histogram in your camera, then you don't really have to pay too much attention to it right now.
I see that. I'm thinking, again, when I look at this, I see these are sort of votes for this shade in here, right? This is how much of the picture. There's a lot of this tone in here.
Right. That's the amount of
the relation in this line, is that really what we're getting that, or are we still getting this? Or I'm sort of trying to figure out how this line affects this, like this part of the grid, for example. I mean, if you pull this up, you're going to get more of this right in here, right? And I'm just trying to understand how that's done.
Yeah. So Preston's just trying to understand how the diagonal line compares, affects the histogram in the background. I'm sure that there's a way that it affects it. I don't know that much detail about what curves, the details of curves, and I'm sure it's out there somewhere. The thing I think that you need to do is just ignore the histogram in the background, and just say, well, what do I need to work on my picture as a whole? Because then you're not really dealing too much with the histogram anymore once you're starting to process your picture, because that's already done, and there's not much you could really do about it. You could do a little bit about it in camera raw by adjusting the exposure, and that's really about it. But the main thing is that is to watch what the effect of these various tools have on your picture. Is it good or is it bad? And so is the adjustment that you make on curves, is that going to improve your picture or make it look worse? So then that's really what you have to decide. And then and also just know how curves affects different parts of the picture. If I pull over the upper right hand line like that, it's going to brighten some of these stars. I mean, even though the actual histogram is down here, it's going to affect these stars. I think that there's not a direct correlation between this line and the histogram, if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you drag that across the top there like that, middle way down, that's where the highlights are, and I can see how that line is raising the highlights, the middle highlights. When you do that.
In the photo, yeah.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. So the main thing is to play with curves and see what it does to your picture.
Sure.
Because the best way is to just open it and play around with it. Raise it up, put it down, see what happens. If you hit the Alt or Option key, the cancel key becomes a reset. You could reset everything you've done, and then start all over with this one. But if what I did is I'm making the sky, making the Milky Way kind of stand out, and so I'm trying to make the sky the way I like to see the Milky Way, the way that I saw it when I was out there in the Rocky Mountains. But what it does is, of course, now I got a lot of extra contrast in the rocks here. I lost a lot of detail on the right side here, and they become very, very dark. I mean, much darker than I would want them to be. And that's because when you open up any of the tools, and then you start making adjustments, it's doing a global adjustment. It's adjusting everything from side to side in your frame. All the pixels in your frame are being adjusted in some way, and so your entire picture is being adjusted. And history is another great window, because if you make a mistake, you could just go back one step, and magic, you're back to where you started from. So I'm back to the very when I opened the picture. This is what it looked like on the computer screen. So with night sky pictures, there's often, and with also with landscapes, there's often a big difference between the sky and the foreground in terms of brightness and color and contrast. So you often need to work on one part or the other. And so doing the global changes often doesn't work really good. I like the tone in the rocks. Maybe I'll make the bottom part a little bit darker, because these are a little bit light. The other thing to look for in a lot of photographs, both the night sky and any kind of photographs, light portions draw your eye. So that if there's something really light in the picture, it's going to draw your eye, and you're naturally just going to look down to wherever it's light. The Milky Way is a great attractor for your eye, because it's a bright band of light in the sky. So you'll generally look to that. In this picture, this area along the bottom part toward the right side of the picture is also, the rocks are pretty light. So that draws my eye down there, and if I'm showing this picture to people, I don't want them to be looking down at the rocks here, because then as your eye goes down toward the bottom of the frame, it just keeps on going, and then your eye is out of the frame. You want people to keep looking within the confines of your image here. You don't want you want them to look more at the stars and probably more the center part of your picture rather than the edge. So that's something we'll deal with later on.